Germany is at risk of a crisis that will shake all of Europe. In fact, the country that for years has been the engine of Europe is now caught in a combination of weak growth, industrial crisis, and a rising far right. With FD reaching 20.8% in the 2025 elections, an increase of over 10 percentage points compared to 2021, thus becoming the second largest party in the German Bundestag. But the problem is that Germany is the largest economy on the continent and the main financier of the European Union, so if Berlin becomes unstable, all of Europe pays the consequences. Right when Russia, China, and the United States are becoming more and more threatening. I noticed that many of you watch my videos and I'm really happy about that, but you're not subscribed to the channel. So if you appreciate my content, please subscribe. It's free for you, but it's really vital for the project. Thank you very much. Germany's strength has always been based on an economy capable of producing high value-added goods, selling them all over the world, and turning that industrial power into political influence within the European Union and around the world. And of course, the German model wasn't as fascinating as the American one, but it worked because it combined competitive factories, relatively affordable energy, solid public finances, American protection, and a pragmatic political culture. But today, that model has cracked. Cheap Russian energy is no longer the foundation of German industry. China is no longer just a market for German companies, but also a competitor. The United States has become more protectionist, and abandoning nuclear power makes the energy issue even more critical. All this drives up costs for Germany and reduces sales opportunities for German companies. In fact, the German central bank forecasts GDP growth for Germany of only 0.5% in 2026 and 0.8% in 2027. And so Friedrich Merz's government responded with a package of reforms on taxes, pensions, labor, and bureaucracy, also to try to regain some support and contain the growth of FD in the polls. However, reforming a large economy is difficult and takes a lot of time, while for those who are in the opposition, it's easy to attack those in power when things are going badly. The fact is that to understand German politics, we have to start from the so-called Brandmauer, that is, the political firewall built by traditional German parties to isolate and prevent any collaboration with far-right forces. And logically, this rule is due to Germany's 20th century past and the decision to build a democracy capable of defending itself from the risk of totalitarian drift. However, today that wall is starting to wobble. And not only because the far right, which is gaining support, risks making it difficult to form coalitions without the far right itself on board, but also because of the left. In fact, the BSV, a far-left party, wrote to the leaders of the AfD rejecting the logic of the Brandmauer and proposing the idea of regional governments led by presidents also supported by the AfD. This is important because it tells us that the problem is not only the radical right gaining support against traditional parties, but also the possible convergence between different anti-system forces which are still extremist and share hostility towards the system. Skepticism towards Brussels and a softer stance towards Russia. Of course, for now we're talking about agreements at the regional level, not the federal one, and it's not certain that real deals will be reached, but the signal is still strong and it's possible that this could expand to the national level in the future and maybe even to other parties. And Chancellor Friedrich Merz's CDU finds itself at the center of this pressure because at the same time it has to compete with the AfD without chasing it too far to the right. Then it has to defend the Brandmauer without appearing deaf to the voters' discontent. Then it has to reform the economy, and as if that weren't enough, it has to lead Europe while internal support is weakening. But why is the AfD growing so much? The AfD is growing because a part of German society feels insecure and underrepresented. And the party's support comes from several issues, because at first the AfD was mainly Eurosceptic, then it also grew on immigration, and today it also taps into economic hardship and distrust toward traditional politics. Then the AfD in particular is very strong among voters in Eastern Germany because in many areas of the former East Germany there is a feeling of having been integrated into the Federal Republic without really being listened to by Berlin. In Thuringia, for example, in the former East Germany, in the 2025 federal elections, the AfD received 38.6% of the votes, becoming the leading political force in Thuringia. While at the national level, as mentioned earlier, the party reached 20.8%. These numbers show that the AfD is not growing in the same way throughout Germany. In Western Germany, the party is strong but more contained, while in Eastern Germany, the AfD is already a dominant force. And then there's the economy, which strengthens the far right. Germany is still the leading economy in Europe, with a GDP of over $4.5 trillion, but besides the absolute level of wealth, what also matters is the perception, increasingly widespread among Germans, that this model is collapsing, because Germany built its economic identity on three pillars: a strong industry, affordable energy, and exports. But today, all three of those pillars are in crisis. And in fact, for this year, GDP growth is expected to be only 0.5%, and in 2027, just 0.8%. And the energy issue weighs heavily, because for years, German competitiveness was also based on low-cost Russian energy, which allowed German industry to keep costs down and remain competitive in global markets. So when that channel was cut off in 2022 after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Germany lost the advantage on which it had built part of its industrial model. But the key point, mind you, is not that relations with Moscow should have been maintained. The key point instead is that this shock hit a system that seemed unstoppable, but in reality, over the decades, had ignored important strategic limits. First of all, the excessive dependence on energy supplies from a single country, Russia. But that's not all. In recent years, Berlin has also abandoned nuclear power, further increasing the vulnerability of the entire German economic and industrial system. However, Germany's problem doesn't come only from Russian gas, but also from the global situation. In fact, the German Council of Economic Experts has cut the growth forecast for 2026 from 0.9% to 0.5%, citing among the causes the conflict in the Middle East, energy prices, and Donald Trump's aggressive trade policy. While for 2027 it forecasts a growth of 0.8%, and then making Germans feel even poorer, there's also inflation. In fact, average inflation is expected to be 3% in 2026 and 2.8% in 2027, with higher energy prices therefore reducing the purchasing power of families and consequently slowing down consumption, which also means lower earnings for businesses. And making things even worse is also the change in China's role, because for years China has been a major market for many German companies. Today, however, China is no longer just a customer for Germany, but also a direct competitor. Precisely in the traditional sectors of German manufacturing, like in mechanical engineering, the competition from Chinese suppliers is now evident, and this weighs heavily on German industry, both in the domestic market and in foreign markets, that is, in countries where Germany used to export more easily. So Germany, in addition to suffering from a cost shock, is above all suffering from a structural transformation of industrial competition at a global level. In this context, the AfD finds a very convenient political opening because it takes a complex economic crisis and reduces it to a much simpler explanation than it really is. And in fact, Alice Weidel, the leader of AfD, said that Germany should stop boycotting Russian oil and gas, arguing that low-cost energy from Russia was the secret to the success of the German economy. And on the electoral level, this works because it starts from a real problem that people see in their daily lives, that is, the increase in energy costs and costs in general, and turns it into an easy-to-understand solution, which is to go back to buying from Russia. But this is an answer that really appeals to the gut of the electorate, and much less to the underlying problems, because it almost completely ignores the fact that it was precisely that energy dependence on Russia that made Germany more fragile and helped create today's crisis. And above all, it leaves the real structural issues in the background. That is, in addition to the lack of energy diversification, the abandonment of nuclear power, the loss of industrial competitiveness, Chinese competition, and the weakening of the German export model. The fact is that in Germany and in Europe, many are starting to fear the rise of FD. In fact, FD is not seen by German institutions as a normal populist party. In Germany, part of the state even considers it a risk to the constitutional order. And this is where the domestic intelligence service that protects the German constitution comes into play, because in 2025, the agency classified AfD as a right-wing extremist organization, paving the way for tighter controls on the party based on a confidential 1,100-page report. But be careful, AfD is not banned. And in February 2026, a German court also temporarily blocked the use of the right-wing extremist classification, pending a final decision. The fact remains, however, that on one side, there are parts of the state that see AfD as a risk to German democracy. On the other hand, however, the party received 20.8% of the votes in the 2025 federal elections and has 152 seats out of 630 in the German Bundestag, that is, the parliament. And the reality is that if the state hits FD too hard, the party could claim to be persecuted by the system and thus become even stronger. This is also why the German Minister of the Interior said that the best way to stop FD is to govern better. But why could this crisis overwhelm the whole of Europe? The German crisis could overwhelm Europe because many European decisions depend on Germany's ability to lead, mediate, and finance. Berlin is in fact crucial for European industry, for the Union's budget, for supporting Ukraine, and for any credible common defense project. So if Germany comes to a political standstill, the European Union slows down. But even worse, if Germany were to become Eurosceptic and more open toward Putin, then both the European Union and support for Ukraine would become much more fragile. And unfortunately, this isn't political fantasy. The positions of the AfD touch precisely on these issues. The party calls for lifting sanctions against Russia and opposes sending weapons to Ukraine. At the European level, this would have very serious consequences. If the most important country in the European Union started pushing to ease sanctions on Russia and reduce military support to Kyiv, it would become difficult to keep the European front together. Not everyone would follow Berlin, but without it, Europe would struggle more since it's the capital of the most powerful country. Similar forces are rising in other European countries, but there is also some good news we must mention. The German federal elections aren't until 2029, so there are almost 3 years left. Meanwhile, Merz could enact changes or the situation in other European countries might improve. Not to mention the fact that if Trump's MAGA movement loses momentum in the United States, maybe Washington itself will be able to contain the damage. But these are just hypotheses. And what do you think? Will Germany be able to get through this moment? Let me know in the comments, leave a like, hype it up, and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy my content. Bye!